Imagine being invited somewhere, not to be honored, not to be welcomed, but to be laughed at. That's what happened to Grace Williams. Grace spent her days cleaning offices no one noticed, wiping fingerprints off glass doors polished enough to reflect lives she was never meant to live. Executives walked past her without looking. Assistants spoke over her. And the CEO's wife, Vanessa Harper, made sure Grace always remembered she was invisible. So when the invitation arrived, thick cream paper sealed in gold, Grace thought it was a mistake. A black tie corporate gala, hosted by the Harpers, her name printed neatly at the center, but kindness wasn't what waited inside that envelope. It was a trap. Vanessa didn't invite Grace to sit among them. She invited her to be the joke, to watch wealthy guests laugh, to let humiliation do the talking. Grace stood alone in her small apartment that night, holding the invitation like it weighed 100 pounds. She could stay home and protect her pride. Or she could walk into the room they believed she didn't belong in. What Vanessa didn't know, what no one in that building knew, was that Grace Williams had been erased once before. And this time, she wasn't going quietly. If you've ever been ignored, underestimated, or treated like you didn't belong, tap like, hit subscribe, and stay with us. Because what happens next isn't just a story. It's a reminder that dignity can't be erased. And sometimes the people everyone overlooks carry the most powerful truths of all. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers. Your support means everything. Grace Williams learned early that invisibility could be a kind of armor. If you didn't speak too loudly, didn't move too fast, didn't meet people's eyes for too long, you could pass through a room without becoming a target. And for years, that's exactly how Grace survived. Every morning before the city fully woke, she stepped off the bus 3 blocks from Harper Industries, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. The building rose ahead of her like a monument to power, glass walls, polished steel, and lights that never seemed to turn off. Inside those walls, deals were made that changed lives, just not hers. Grace signed in through the service entrance, the one tucked around the back near the loading bay. She wore the same blue cleaning uniform every day, freshly washed but faded at the seams. Her hair was always neatly wrapped, her shoes practical, her movements quiet and efficient. She did her job well, too well sometimes. By 7:30 a.m., the executive floors were spotless. Desks gleamed, windows shone, trash bins were empty before anyone noticed they'd ever been full. Grace took pride in that, not because anyone praised her, but because the work was honest. And it was hers. By 8 the building came alive. Men in tailored suits walked past her without slowing down, eyes glued to phones. Women in heels clicked across the parquet. Marble floors, coffee in one hand, schedules in the other. Conversations floated through the air, stock prices, acquisitions, vacations in place Grace had only seen on television. She heard everything. People talked freely when they thought no one important was listening. And to them, Grace wasn't important. She was part of the background, like the walls, like the carpet. Sometimes, someone would step around her cleaning cart without a word. Other times, they'd sigh loudly, annoyed that she existed in their path. Very rarely, someone said thank you. When they did, it startled her every time. Grace never complained. Complaints didn't pay rent. Pride didn't buy groceries. Silence was safer. But there was one person in that building who never let Grace forget her place. Vanessa Harper. The CEO's wife didn't work at Harper Industries, but she might as well have owned it. She swept through the halls like she was inspecting property she already controlled. Designer heels, perfect hair, a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Grace had learned to recognize the sound of those heels. Whenever Vanessa appeared, the air shifted. Assistants straightened, executives stood taller, people smiled wider. Grace lowered her head. On most days, Vanessa ignored her completely. But ignoring Grace wasn't enough. Not for someone like her. That morning, Grace was wiping fingerprints off a glass conference room door when she felt it. That familiar presence behind her. The sudden silence. The pause. Grace stepped aside instinctively. "Be careful," Vanessa said, her voice smooth and sharp at the same time. "That glass costs more than you probably make in a year." A few women standing behind her laughed, not loudly, just enough. Grace felt the heat rise in her chest. She swallowed it down. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. Vanessa looked her up and down like she was inspecting an object. "Honestly," she added, "I don't understand why they let staff wander around the executive floor during business hours." Staff. Grace nodded, eyes on the floor, hands gripping her cloth until her knuckles ached. Vanessa waved a manicured hand dismissively and walked on, laughter trailing behind her like perfume. Grace waited until the sound of heels faded before she straightened. She told herself the same thing she always did. It's just words. Let it pass. But some days, words lingered. Later that afternoon, Grace cleaned the break room on the 32nd floor. Through the glass walls, she could see the city stretched out below. Tiny cars, tiny people, tiny lives. Sometimes she wondered what it felt like to stand at the top of something and believe you belonged there. She shook the thought away. Belonging was a luxury. By the time her shift ended, Grace's feet ached and her shoulders felt heavy. She signed out, collected her coat, and headed toward the exit until a voice stopped her. "Grace." She turned. Vanessa Harper stood near the front desk, holding a small cream-colored envelope between her fingers. Two women flanked her, both watching Grace with barely contained amusement. Grace's stomach tightened. "Yes, ma'am?" Vanessa smiled, slowly, deliberately, the kind of smile that meant something else was coming. "I've been meaning to catch you," she said. "I have something for you." She extended the envelope. Grace stared at it, confused. The paper was thick, expensive. Her name was written neatly on the front. For a moment, her mind couldn't catch up. "For me?" Grace asked. Vanessa tilted her head. "An invitation," she said lightly, "to our corporate gala this weekend. Black tie." One of the women behind her covered her mouth, already laughing. Grace felt the floor tilt beneath her. A gala? For her? Her instincts screamed at once. This wasn't kindness. This wasn't generosity. Vanessa's eyes sparkled, not with warmth, but with anticipation. "Don't worry," she added. "Wear whatever you like, just maybe not the uniform. We don't want people getting confused." The women laughed openly now. Grace took the envelope with trembling hands. "Thank you," she said, because that was what survival demanded. Vanessa's smile widened. As Grace walked away, the envelope felt heavier with every step. She didn't need to open it to understand what it was. It wasn't an invitation, it was a setup. And standing there in the fading afternoon light, Grace Williams faced a choice she hadn't expected, one that would change everything. Stay invisible, or finally be seen. Grace didn't open the envelope right away. She carried it home like something fragile, tucked carefully into her coat pocket as if it might break or explode, if handled too roughly. The bus ride felt longer than usual. Every bump in the road sent the thick paper shifting against her chest, a constant reminder that something had changed. When she finally stepped into her apartment, the silence wrapped around her. The place was small but clean. A second-hand couch pressed against one wall, a narrow table by the window, a single framed photograph resting crookedly on the shelf. Her mother, smiling, taken long before life had hardened Grace's edges. She set her bag down slowly and stood in the middle of the room, staring at nothing. Only then did she pull out the envelope, cream-colored, heavy, sealed with gold. Grace had cleaned offices for years, but this belonged to a world she wasn't meant to touch. The kind of paper people like Vanessa used for announcements, not apologies. Her name was printed neatly on the front, Grace Williams. Seeing it there, So formal, so deliberate, made her throat tighten. She sat on the edge of her bed and broke the seal. Inside was a single card. You are cordially invited to the Harper Industries Black Tie Gala. Saturday, 7:00 p.m., the Grand Helix Ballroom. Black tie. Grace let out a slow breath. Black tie meant gowns that cost more than her rent, shoes that bruised feet but signaled belonging, rooms filled with people who would look through her like glass. It wasn't hard to picture what Vanessa wanted. Grace arriving in something too simple, standing alone, whispers spreading, laughter behind raised champagne glasses. Who invited her? Does she know she doesn't belong here? Grace closed her eyes. The humiliation wasn't an accident. It was the point. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, the card resting on her chest like a weight. Memories crept in uninvited. Other rooms, other eyes, other moments when she'd felt small, when she'd learned that being quiet kept you safe. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from the building's cleaning supervisor reminding her about an early shift tomorrow. Life didn't stop just because someone decided to hurt you. Grace sat up and folded the invitation carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. She told herself she wouldn't go. She told herself it wasn't worth it. But the lie didn't settle. That night, sleep refused to come. She turned from side to side, the sound of Vanessa's laughter echoing in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined the room, bright lights, expensive dresses, faces turning toward her. She imagined walking in and walking out. By morning, Grace felt hollow. At work, the building buzzed with talk of the gala. Assistants compared dresses. Executives joked about speeches. Someone mentioned a celebrity guest. Grace kept her head down, but the words followed her everywhere. Did you hear? The Harpers spared no expense this year. I heard it's invite only. Very exclusive. Grace wiped down a conference table that already sparkled. Her reflection stared back at her in the polished surface. Tired eyes, calm face, shoulders squared out of habit. At lunch, she sat alone in the small break room reserved for cleaning staff. The invitation sat folded inside her bag. She reached for it, then stopped. Why does this bother me so much? She wondered. Vanessa had insulted her before. She'd survived worse than laughter. But this was different. This wasn't a passing comment or a cruel remark tossed over a shoulder. This was intentional, planned, designed. They wanted her to show up just enough to be seen, but not enough to be respected. Grace clenched her jaw. That afternoon, as she mopped the executive hallway, she overheard Vanessa again. Her voice carried easily through the open doors. Do you think she'll come? Vanessa asked someone, her tone light, amused. A pause, then laughter. Oh, I hope she does. It'll be unforgettable. Grace's hands tightened around the mop handle. Something inside her shifted. That evening, when she got home, she didn't put the envelope away. She placed it on the table where she could see it. She cooked dinner she barely tasted, washed the dishes she barely noticed. Finally, she sat down and reached for her phone. There was one name she hadn't said out loud in years: Claire Bennett. Grace stared at the contact, her thumb hovering over the screen. Claire had been more than a friend once. She'd been part of a life Grace had buried, a life filled with purpose, confidence, and choices. Calling her felt like opening a door she'd nailed shut. The phone rang, once, twice. Grace, Claire's voice came through, startled and warm all at once. Oh my God, is that really you? Grace closed her eyes. It's me, she said softly. I need help. There was a pause, then certainty. Tell me everything. Grace let out a breath she'd been holding for years. She didn't explain the insult first. She explained the weight, the years of being unseen, the invitation that felt like a dare. Claire listened. She always had. When Grace finished, there was silence on the line, then resolve. Grace, Claire said, her voice steady. If you walk into that room, you will not walk in alone. Not this time. Tears burned behind Grace's eyes. I don't want revenge, Grace whispered. I don't want to feel small anymore. Claire didn't hesitate. Then don't, she said. Come to the gala as yourself. Grace swallowed. For the first time since receiving the invitation, she allowed herself to imagine something else. Not humiliation, but presence. Not hiding, but standing. And as the city lights flickered on outside her window, Grace Williams made a decision that would change the story Vanessa thought she was writing. She would go, not as a joke, but as a woman who remembered who she was. Grace didn't sleep that night. After hanging up with Claire, she sat on the edge of her bed with her phone still in her hand, staring at the wall as if the past might materialize there if she looked long enough. The decision had been made. She would go to the gala, but deciding to show up was easier than deciding who she would show up as. The invitation lay open on the table. Black tie. The words felt like a challenge. Grace rose and crossed the room to the small closet she rarely opened. Inside were coats she no longer wore, shoes she saved for special occasions that never came, and at the very back, a cardboard box sealed with old tape. Her chest tightened as she pulled it out. She hadn't opened that box in years. Grace sat on the floor and peeled the tape away slowly, like she was afraid of waking something that had been asleep for too long. The smell of old paper and lavender drifted up, her mother's scent, preserved in memory. Inside were photographs, not of the woman Harper Industries knew. In the pictures, Grace stood tall, confident, laughing. She wore tailored dresses, her hair styled, her eyes bright with purpose. She stood beside podiums, smiled with community leaders, cut ribbons at openings she once helped build. Her fingers trembled as she lifted one photograph after another. There she was, shaking hands with a city council member. There she was again, standing in front of a banner that read, Williams Community Initiative. She swallowed hard. Once, Grace Williams had been someone people listened to. She closed her eyes, and the memories came rushing back. Her father's voice, steady and proud, telling her that leadership wasn't about power, it was about responsibility. Her mother reminding her that dignity wasn't something people handed you. It was something you carried, even when no one was looking. Grace had believed them. She'd gone to college. She'd worked late nights building programs for families who needed support. She'd stood in rooms just like the gala hall would be, only back then, people leaned in when she spoke. Then everything fell apart. A trusted partner had stolen money in her name. Legal battles followed. Donors disappeared. The initiative collapsed under the weight of scandal Grace hadn't caused, but couldn't escape. And then, as if life needed one final blow, her parents were gone. First her father, then her mother, in the span of a single year. Grief hollowed her out. The phone stopped ringing. Invitations stopped coming. The city moved on. Grace remembered the day she packed her office into boxes, the way people avoided her eyes, as if proximity to her failure might stain them. She remembered choosing silence over explanation, survival over pride. Becoming invisible hadn't been her plan. It had been her refuge. She opened her eyes and looked at the woman in the photos again. "I'm still here," she whispered, unsure who she was saying it to. The next morning, a black SUV pulled up outside her building. Grace watched from the window as Claire Bennett stepped out, every inch the woman she'd always been. Confident, sharp, impossible to ignore. Claire looked up, spotted Grace, and smiled like she'd found something she'd been missing. Grace's heart skipped. When she opened the door, Claire pulled her into a hug without hesitation, like no time had passed at all. "You look tired," Claire said gently, holding Grace at arm's length. "But you're still you." Grace laughed softly, the sound catching in her throat. "I don't feel like it." Claire shook her head. "That's because you forgot. I'm here to remind you." Inside the apartment, Grace showed her the box, the photos, the certificates, the pieces of a life she'd locked away. Claire handled them carefully, reverently. They erased you, Claire said quietly. But you didn't disappear. They spent the day talking, really talking, for the first time in years. Grace told her about Harper Industries, about Vanessa, about the invitation that felt like a dare. Claire listened, then opened her laptop. If you're walking into that room, she said, you're walking in as Grace Williams, not their version of you. Grace hesitated. I don't have the money for... Stop, Claire cut in, not unkindly. This isn't about money, it's about truth. They worked like architects rebuilding something sacred. Claire sketched designs. Grace made choices, real ones, for the first time in years. Fabric was chosen not to impress, but to fit. Shoes that would carry her, not cripple her. Jewelry that spoke quietly instead of shouting. Every decision stripped away fear and replaced it with intention. As evening fell, Claire stepped back and studied Grace. Stand up, she said. Grace did. Her posture changed instinctively, shoulders back, chin level. The woman in the mirror looked unfamiliar, but not foreign. That's her, Claire said softly. That's the woman they forgot. Grace met her own gaze. The doubt was still there. But something stronger had taken root beneath it. This wasn't about showing them up. It was about showing up. When Claire left that night, Grace sat alone again. But the silence felt different. Not empty, expectant. She placed the invitation beside the photographs on the table, two versions of her life, finally in the same room. And for the first time in years, Grace Williams didn't look away. She let herself remember, and she let herself believe that when she walked into that gala, she wouldn't just be entering a room, she'd be stepping back into herself. The days leading up to the gala passed differently than Grace expected. Not louder, not brighter, just heavier. Every morning she still put on her blue uniform and boarded the bus before sunrise. She still signed in through the service entrance. She still cleaned offices where people spoke over her and past her. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside Grace, everything had. She noticed it first in the way she walked. Her steps were steadier now, slower. She no longer shrank when executives passed too close or when assistants brushed by without apology. She still moved aside, but she no longer folded into herself. When she did, Vanessa noticed. On Wednesday afternoon, Grace was polishing the chrome rail outside the executive boardroom when Vanessa emerged mid-conversation, phone pressed to her ear. She stopped short when she saw Grace. For a split second, something flickered across Vanessa's face. Confusion, maybe, or irritation. Grace met her eyes. Just for a moment. Vanessa recovered quickly, scoffing and turning away, but the damage was done. Grace felt it like a spark in her chest. She hadn't looked away. That night, Claire returned with garment bags and a calm sense of certainty that filled the apartment. They laid everything out carefully, like pieces of a puzzle that had waited years to be assembled. The dress wasn't loud. It didn't scream wealth or beg for attention. It was elegant in the way truth often is. Simple lines, deep color, tailored to Grace's body as if it had always belonged to her. Grace ran her fingers over the fabric, afraid to believe it was real. "What if they laugh anyway?" she asked quietly. Claire paused. "Then they reveal themselves," she said. "Not you." They practiced nothing. No speeches, no responses. Claire refused. "You don't need lines," she said. "Your presence will do the talking." On Friday evening, Grace stood alone in her bathroom, staring at her reflection. Her hair was still wrapped, her face bare. She looked like she always did. She whispered to the mirror, "You're allowed to be here." The words sounded strange, but necessary. Saturday arrived, wrapped in bright sunlight, the kind that made everything feel exposed. Grace moved through the day, slowly, deliberately. She ate breakfast she barely tasted. She cleaned the apartment she already kept spotless. At noon, Claire arrived. Transformation wasn't sudden. It unfolded gently. Hair first, styled neatly, framing Grace's face instead of hiding it. Makeup next, not to change her, but to highlight what had always been there. When Grace put on the dress, her hands shook. She didn't recognize the woman in the mirror at first, not because she looked different, but because she looked whole. "You don't owe them anything," Claire said, adjusting a clasp. "Not explanations, not forgiveness, not even attention." Grace nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat. The drive to the venue was quiet. The city blurred past the window as Grace watched familiar streets give way to manicured lawns and towering gates. Her heartbeat grew louder with every mile. The car slowed. Lights, music, voices. They had arrived. Claire stepped out first, then turned and offered her hand. Grace hesitated only a second before taking it. The sound hit her immediately. The hum of conversation, the clink of glasses, the low swell of music. The entrance glowed with warm light. Guests stood in clusters, laughing easily, completely unaware that something was about to shift. Grace took one breath. Then she stepped forward. The effect was instant. Conversation stumbled. A laugh cut off mid-sentence. A man lowered his glass without realizing it. Heads turned. Not because Grace demanded attention, but because something about her claimed it. She didn't rush. She didn't search for anyone's approval. She walked. Inside the hall, Vanessa Harper stood near the center, radiant in white, surrounded by friends. She was laughing until she wasn't. Her smile froze. Her eyes narrowed. Grace saw the moment Vanessa recognized her. Not the uniform, not the invisibility. Her. The room grew quieter. Grace felt every eye, every question forming behind polite smiles. She reached the edge of the crowd and stopped, not waiting, not hiding, just standing. And in that stillness, Grace Williams understood something she'd forgotten for years. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply arrives, unannounced, and refuses to leave. The night had only just begun. Silence has a sound. Grace felt it settle over the room like a held breath. The music didn't stop, but it faded into the background, softened by the sudden awareness rippling through the crowd. People looked at her the way they look at something unexpected, curious, cautious, unsure whether to stare or look away. She stood still, hands relaxed at her sides, heart steady despite the pounding in her ears. Across the room, Vanessa Harper recovered first. She always did. Vanessa's smile snapped back into place. Though it didn't reach her eyes, she handed her glass to someone nearby and moved toward Grace with calculated grace, heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Well," Vanessa said brightly, stopping just short of her, "this is a surprise." Grace met her gaze calmly. "It seems to be." Vanessa laughed, a light, brittle sound. "I didn't think you'd actually come." A few people nearby chuckled uncertainly. Grace tilted her head slightly. "You invited me." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Yes, well, I meant..." She waved her hand vaguely. "It's good to see you making an effort." Grace smiled, just enough. "So did you." The air shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just different. Vanessa flushed, color creeping up her neck. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Enjoy the night," she said through her teeth. "Try not to stand out." Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to. Vanessa turned away, her steps a fraction faster than before. Whispers began almost immediately. "Who is she?" "She doesn't look like staff." "Do you know her?" Grace moved deeper into the room, guided not by purpose but by instinct. She paused near a tall table, fingers brushing the smooth edge as she listened. Her presence unsettled people, not because she was loud, but because she didn't apologize for being there. Then she heard it. Her name. "Grace?" The voice was tentative, almost disbelieving. She turned. A man stood a few steps away, older, silver hair, neatly combed, eyes wide as if he were staring at a ghost. He studied her face like he was piecing together a memory long buried. "Grace Williams?" he asked. Her chest tightened. "Yes," she said carefully. His hand flew to his mouth. "My God, it is you." People around them leaned in. "I worked with your father," he said, emotion thickening his voice. "The Williams Initiative. You were remarkable." The room seemed to tilt. Grace felt the weight of every eye shift, from curiosity to recognition. "I wondered what happened to you," the man continued. "After everything. We all did." Murmurs spread. "Williams Initiative? That was her? No way." Grace nodded once. "Life happened." The man reached for her hand, squeezing it warmly. "Your work changed lives. Don't ever forget that." She didn't trust herself to speak. Across the room, Daniel Harper finally looked up from his conversation. His eyes found Grace, then widened. He stared, something between confusion and realization crossing his face. He excused himself quickly, moving through the crowd toward them. Vanessa noticed too late. "Grace," Daniel said, stopping in front of her. This is unexpected." Grace inclined her head politely. "Mr. Harper." He looked at her, really looked at her, like he was seeing a piece of his own company's history standing in front of him. "The Williams Initiative," he said slowly. "That framework, some of our earliest community partnerships were built on that model." Grace met his eyes. "I know," Daniel swallowed. Around them, the crowd had gone quiet again, not stunned this time, attentive. Vanessa stepped forward, laughter forced and sharp. "Let's not turn this into a history lesson," she said. "It's a celebration." Daniel didn't take his eyes off Grace. "History matters," he said quietly. Vanessa stiffened. Grace felt something loosen in her chest. Not triumph, not revenge, recognition. She hadn't come to expose anyone. She hadn't come to humiliate. She'd come as herself. And now the room knew her name. Not as a cleaning lady, not as a joke, but as Grace Williams, a woman with a past that couldn't be erased and a presence that refused to be ignored. The night wasn't over, but the balance had already shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. The room no longer belonged to Vanessa. Grace could feel it in the way conversation stalled when Daniel Harper spoke, in the way people leaned in now, listening, not to gossip, but to truth unfolding in real time. The air had changed. What had once been Vanessa's stage was suddenly unfamiliar ground. Daniel cleared his throat. "Grace," he said again, quieter this time. "I had no idea you were working in our building." Grace nodded. Most people didn't. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling across his shoulders. He glanced around at the gathered guests, board members, donors, executives, and something in his expression hardened. "Vanessa," he said calmly, "did you know who Grace was?" Vanessa laughed a little too quickly. "Of course not," she said. She stopped herself, eyes darting. "She's staff." Grace watched her carefully. This was the moment Vanessa had always believed she controlled. A room full of witnesses, a story she could spin, but stories require willing listeners. Daniel didn't look away from Grace. "The Williams Initiative," he continued. "Your father's work influenced our earliest outreach programs. We've benefited from that foundation for years." Vanessa's smile cracked. "Well, that doesn't mean—" Grace stepped forward. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," Grace said, her voice steady but clear. "And I didn't come to remind you of my past." She paused, letting the room breathe. "I came because I was invited." The simplicity of it landed harder than accusation ever could. Vanessa's face flushed deep red. "This was supposed to be a private event," she snapped. "I didn't expect—" "You didn't expect me to show up," Grace said gently. "I understand." A ripple of discomfort moved through the crowd. Daniel turned to his wife. his voice low but unmistakably firm. "Why invite her at all?" Vanessa faltered, just for a second. Then the truth slipped. "It was just a joke," she said. "I didn't think she'd—" Silence. The word joke hung in the air like something rotten. Daniel's jaw tightened. "A joke," he repeated. Grace met Vanessa's eyes. There was no anger there, only clarity. "There's nothing funny about humiliation," Grace said, "especially when it's deliberate." Someone in the crowd cleared their throat. Another shifted uncomfortably. Phones remained lowered, not out of politeness, but because this moment didn't belong to spectacle. Daniel stepped back slightly, his gaze sweeping the room. "This gala is meant to celebrate achievement," he said. "And tonight, I'm realizing we've overlooked more than we acknowledged." He turned back to Grace. "You deserved better." Vanessa opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came. Grace felt the weight lift, not because she'd won, but because she'd spoken her truth without shrinking. She nodded once. "Thank you." The applause started softly, one pair of hands, then another. It grew, not loud, not wild, but sincere. Vanessa's grip tightened around her clutch. She looked around desperately, searching for allies, for laughter, for anything to restore control. There was nothing. She turned sharply and walked away, heels striking the floor with brittle urgency. No one followed. Grace watched her go, not with satisfaction, but with release. Daniel faced the guests again. "We'll take a brief pause," he announced. "Please enjoy the evening." The music resumed, tentative at first, then smoother. People approached Grace, not all at once, but carefully. Some recognized her work, others apologized quietly. Some simply nodded, respect in their eyes. Grace accepted none of it like a prize. She accepted it like a return. Later, as the night softened, Grace stepped outside onto the terrace. The city lights stretched out before her, steady and endless. Claire joined her, resting against the railing. "You did it," she said softly. Grace shook her head. "I just showed up." Claire smiled. That was enough. Grace breathed in the cool night air, her heart finally calm. She hadn't come to reclaim power. She'd come to reclaim herself. And in doing so, she'd reminded everyone watching that dignity doesn't need permission. It only needs presence. The night would end, but the story had already changed. Grace didn't stay much longer after that, not because she felt unwelcome, but because she no longer needed the room to validate what she already knew. The applause had faded into conversation again. The gala returned to its rhythm, but something had shifted beneath the surface, something that wouldn't be undone by music or champagne. As Grace moved through the crowd toward the exit, people stepped aside for her, not hurriedly, not awkwardly, respectfully. She noticed it in the small things: a man holding the door open, a woman offering a quiet smile, a server meeting her eyes and nodding just once, like they shared an understanding. Grace returned each gesture with the same calm grace she'd carried all evening. Outside, the air felt lighter. The city hummed softly beyond the gates, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded. Cars passed, lights changed, life went on. Claire waited by the car, arms folded, a knowing smile on her face. "So," she said, "was it worth it?" Grace looked back at the building one last time, the chandeliers glowing, the laughter drifting faintly through the glass. She thought of the years she'd spent shrinking, of the mornings she'd cleaned those floors without being seen, of the invitation that was meant to humiliate her. "Yes," she said finally, "but not for the reason they think." They drove away without rush. Grace watched the reflection of the city slide across the window, her own face staring back at her, not tired, not afraid, whole. The next morning, Grace woke before her alarm. Sunlight spilled across the room, warm and honest. She brewed coffee, and sat at the table where the invitation still lay. She picked it up. Then she folded it once, and once more, and placed it gently into the trash, not out of anger, but because it no longer held power over her. Later that day, her phone buzzed. A message from an unfamiliar number. "This is Daniel Harper. I'd like to talk about restoring what was lost." Grace stared at the screen. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the world waited, not expectant, not demanding, just open. Grace smiled softly. She hadn't walked into that gala to reclaim a title or a seat at someone else's table. She'd walked in to remember herself, and now she was ready to decide what came next, on her own terms. The crown she wore hadn't been given to her that night. She'd carried it all along, and this time, she wasn't setting it down. Grace didn't return Daniel Harper's call that day, or the next. She went to work as usual, riding the early bus, stepping through the service entrance, tying her apron with the same practiced motion. The building hadn't changed, but the way people looked at her had. Heads lifted when she passed. Conversations paused. A few people smiled, unsure if they should. One executive nodded awkwardly like he was greeting someone he suddenly realized he should have known all along. Grace acknowledged none of it beyond polite calm. She cleaned, because cleaning had never been the problem. In the break room, she sat alone, stirring her coffee slowly. Daniel's message lingered in her thoughts, not as temptation, but as possibility. Restore what was lost. The words sounded heavy, loaded with promises that could collapse just as easily as they formed. Grace had learned the cost of trusting powerful people. That afternoon, as she wiped down a row of desks, her phone buzzed again. Another message. "I understand if you're hesitant. I'd like to listen. Nothing more." Grace stopped wiping. "Listen." She exhaled slowly and typed a response before fear could talk her out of it. "Tomorrow, 1 hour, public place." The reply came almost instantly. "Thank you." They met at a quiet cafe near the river, the kind of place where conversations blurred into background noise. Daniel arrived early, jacket folded over his arm, no assistance in sight. When Grace walked in, he stood. "Grace," he said. She nodded. "Mr. Harper." "Daniel," he corrected gently. "If that's okay." They sat. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel did something Grace hadn't expected. He apologized. Not the polished kind, not the kind designed to move on. "I failed," he said plainly, "as a leader, as a husband, as a human being." Grace listened without reacting. "I didn't know who you were," he continued. "But I should have known how you were treated. That responsibility is mine." Grace folded her hands. "I didn't come to the gala to fix your conscience." "I know," Daniel said. "That's why I asked to meet." He told her about internal reviews already underway, about policies that had existed on paper but never reached the floors Grace worked on, about Vanessa leaving early the next morning, without comment. Grace felt no satisfaction in hearing it, only distance. "You asked about restoring what was lost," she said finally. "Do you know what that really means?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm learning." Grace nodded. "It means accountability that doesn't disappear when the moment passes. It means listening to people you don't usually hear." She leaned forward slightly. "And it means understanding that I don't owe you my past or my future." Daniel met her eyes. "Then let me earn the right to be involved." Grace studied him. She saw sincerity, but she'd seen sincerity before too. "I'll think about it," she said. That night, Grace sat in her apartment with the old box open again. Photos, certificates, the names she'd carried quietly all these years. She didn't feel pressure to resurrect it immediately. This time, the choice was hers. The next few weeks passed in small but meaningful shifts. Grace was reassigned, not promoted, not showcased, but respected. Cleaning schedules changed, Supervisors spoke differently. The building began to feel less like a place she survived and more like one she moved through. One evening, Claire stopped by with takeout and a grin. "You're glowing," she said. Grace laughed. "I'm tired." "Good tired," Claire corrected. "The kind that comes from movement." They ate at the table, talking about possibilities instead of wounds. Grace mentioned Daniel's proposal, vague, open-ended, cautious. "And?" Claire asked. "And I told him, I'm not rebuilding the old thing," Grace said. "If I build again, it'll be something new." Claire raised her glass. "To new." Grace clinked hers softly. Later that night, Grace opened her laptop and typed a single line at the top of a blank document. Mission statement. Her fingers hovered. She didn't know exactly what would come next. But for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something that had already been decided without her. She closed the laptop and stood by the window, watching the city breathe. Grace Williams had walked into a room where she wasn't expected. She'd walked out with something no one could take from her, choice, and tomorrow she would decide what to do with it. Grace didn't rush her decision. For weeks, she let life settle into its new rhythm. She worked. She rested. She listened more than she spoke. People still treated her differently now, but Grace paid attention to who did and how. Respect given only when it was convenient meant nothing to her. Real change was quieter. It showed up in the way supervisors asked for input instead of issuing commands, in the way cleaning staff were finally included in safety briefings, in the way a young intern stopped one morning to say, "Thank you for keeping this place running." Grace smiled and meant it. Daniel Harper checked in occasionally, not with pressure, but with updates. Policy changes, training programs, meetings he invited her to attend, without expectation. She declined most of them, not out of spite, but because she was listening to something else, now, her own pace. One Saturday morning, Grace met Claire at a community center across town. The building was old, the paint chipped, but the rooms were full of energy. Kids laughed in one corner. A volunteer helped an elderly man fill out forms near the door. Grace stood still, taking it in. "This," she said softly, "this is where it starts." Claire smiled. "I had a feeling." They spent the afternoon walking through the space, talking about what it could become. Not grand, not flashy, useful, accessible, honest. Grace felt the familiar spark of purpose stir in her chest. That night, she finally returned Daniel's call. "I've thought about your offer," she said when he answered. "I'm listening," he replied. "I'm not coming back to rebuild the past," Grace said, "but I am willing to build something forward, on my terms." Daniel didn't interrupt. "It won't be branded under your company," she continued. "It won't be performative, and it won't exist to make anyone feel generous." There was a pause, then, "Agreed." Grace exhaled. They discussed logistics briefly, nothing binding. Grace made it clear that control mattered more than funding, that visibility mattered less than impact. Daniel agreed again. When the call ended, Grace sat quietly, phone resting in her lap. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt aligned. Weeks later, Grace stood at the front of the community center, now cleaned, painted, alive. A small sign hung by the door, not large enough to announce itself, but clear enough for those who needed it. The Williams Collective. No speeches, no cameras, just people. Claire stood beside her, hands tucked into her jacket. "You know," she said, "they didn't give you permission for this." Grace smiled. "I didn't ask." Across town, Harper Industries continued to move forward. Vanessa Harper was no longer a presence there. Her absence was quiet, unannounced, and permanent. Grace didn't follow the details. She didn't need to. What mattered was here. A woman approached Grace hesitantly, a young girl standing close beside her. "Someone told me this place could help," the woman said. Grace nodded. "We can try." As they walked inside, Grace felt something settle into place. Not a crown, not a title. A calling. Later, as the sun dipped low and the building emptied, Grace locked the door and leaned against it, breathing in the silence. She thought of the gala, the lights, the whispers, the moment she'd been seen. That night hadn't changed her. It had reminded her. Grace Williams had always known who she was. Now, the world did too. And this time, she wasn't stepping into anyone else's room. She was building her own.